understands that the objective of existence is to achieve perfection within ourselves, he says, let's first understand what it means to perfect oneself. If you understand what it means to perfect oneself, now you understand what it means that you're not. If you understand what you're not and what you have to achieve, then the person focuses and takes initiative to achieve what that objective is, what perfection is. That's what the soul responds to the intellect. He says, however, this concept of perfection, we can understand it in the general sense, but not in a specific sense. He says, and by understanding it, generally speaking, as we advance, in retrospect, we'll understand the details. I'll give you an example. You see the Verrazano Bridge? It's the longest expansion bridge in the world. To be able to build that bridge, you have to take courses in engineering, in physics, and so on and so forth. So the person understands without that knowledge, but does he understand what engineering is? Does he understand what physics is? But he knows he has to enroll in courses to be able to become knowledgeable. Once he's taking the courses of engineering and physics, then he begins understanding what the details and the aspects of the specific areas of physics and engineering you have to be exceptional in to be able to create this edifice called this expansion bridge, which is the longest in the world. So he says, first we have to speak about generally what is perfection. Once we get involved in the process of going towards perfection, then as we go along, we'll be able to understand the details of what is needed to bring about perfection. I'll give you an example. There was no Rav Hai Gaon, who was of the Gaonic period. Every day he would do tshuva. Why did he do tshuva every day? It's not that he sinned, God forbid. Because every day that he advanced, he understood in retrospect where he could have been the day before. The day before, because he didn't achieve the next day, he didn't understand where he should have been the day before. So it's always when you achieve more, then you understand what you need to go forward again. So you only understand the details as you develop and advance in whatever it is. So the soul says to the intellect, he says, let's talk about perfection in general sense. Then we'll get involved in the details. So the intellect responds and says, this concept of perfection, it's understood and obvious from the text of the Torah, and just logically what it is. He says, and what is that? I'll read you the Hebrew. That a person should be able to cleave to the holiness of God. If you're able to cleave to the holiness of God, that itself is an achievement of perfection. Now, there's another story. How do you get there? But that's the objective. The objective is that you should be qualified and perfect enough to cleave to God's infinite, absolute, perfect being, as a perfect being. And because you achieve that level of perfection, you're able to fathom certain things about God without any interruption, without any lack of understanding. There's a pasuk in Isaiah, Os tisanek al Hashem, the word oneg. Then when you achieve perfection, Os tisanek al Hashem, you'll be able to have oneg when you attach yourself to God. And we're not talking about oneg, we correlate to oneg Shabbos. You enjoy the Shabbos because of food, because of environment, because of spirit. If you achieve shleimus os tisanek al Hashem, you'll be able to rejoice, have the greatest level of pleasure being with God. Another verse in Tehillim, David says, Yeshu Yishar Mispanecho, that those who are Yisharim, those who are straight, they will sit before your countenance. That's what it is. If you're Yosher, what's Yosher? You achieved Yashrus, perfection. You worked out all the kinks, so to say. Then you are able to sit before God's countenance. Another verse, Sova smochos es ponecho. One is sated with joy. When are you sated with joy? When you're in the presence of God's countenance. Then you're sated with joy. And he says there are multiple other verses which indicate this also. What is the ultimate level of perfection? When you're worthy and qualified to sit in God's presence and to have that experience, which is the ultimate experience of joy and pleasure. And he says all these various sources are sources in prophets and in scripture, which is obvious to anyone who reads them. And also, it's stated in the words of Chazal, the words of the Talmud. Ha'olam haba, quotes the Gemara in Brachos. What is the world to come? One does not eat, one does not drink, one does not stand, one does not sit. What is the state over there? What is the benefit? What is the level of spiritual experience? The tzaddikim, they sit, meaning they exist there. The crowns are on their heads. And they have benefit from the radiance of the God's presence. That's what the world to come is. The tzaddikim, they sit and they bask in God's radiance. That is what the world to come is all about. Now, the Rambam, in the laws of the fundamentals of Torah, writes, what does it mean, Ichosem Beroshem? The crowns are on their heads. What does that mean? So he explains, that, just to give you an example, a person is an officer in the armed forces. If you're a general, you wear a certain type of insignia. You're a colonel, you wear another type of insignia. You're a lieutenant, you wear another kind of insignia. So the insignia indicates what is your capacity in terms of achievement as you work your way up in the rank. If you wear insignia of a general, that means you have a greater understanding and you have access to many more things than the person who's lower down, although they're all officers, but the different levels of being an officer. And I gave the example, if a person has a cataract, and it's a very thick cataract. So because it's so thick, although the eye is healthy, but because it's covered, all that filters through that membrane is light, and he's able to make out a vague semblance of a form because of the thickness of that membrane. But if the person, let's say it's a very thin membrane, cataract, he basically could see pretty well, doesn't see perfect, because the light comes through and the membrane, which separates, which covers the eye, is a very thin covering, and therefore he's able to see almost perfectly. The person who doesn't have the cataract whatsoever, and he has a healthy eye, because the eye is so healthy, he's able to see clearly, vividly, exactly what that is, and lets you see something which is magnificent. So if you don't have any blockage whatsoever and the eye is healthy, you're touched by what you see. It's amazing. But if you have slight blockage, it's a membrane, but it's thin, you don't see what the person without the cataract sees. So therefore, you're not as amazed and touched the same way. What about a person who barely sees it, but you see something special? Because you don't visualize and see what it is, you're not touched the way the first two categories are touched. You know it's special. You have a sense of its specialness. You feel fortunate you're there. But are you touched by whatever you see because you really don't see it? So the Rambam writes, when it says they sit in the crowns on their heads, the crown is referring to the level of clarity and the level of closeness that you could get close to God. Person lived his life, a life of devoutness, righteousness, and even went beyond the call of duty. He's a chassid. And he did everything correctly because he perfected himself and spiritualized himself to his fullest capacity. He has the full capacity to absorb whatever he's in the presence of. So he's the greatest beneficiary of that experience sitting in the presence of God. The other person who did things not for the sake of God, he had ulterior motives. He makes it into the world to come. But in terms of the purification of his soul, because of the dimension of his soul, if God is perfection, the closer you are to perfection, the greater sense you have of what perfection is. But if you don't have any relevance to what perfection is, you barely touch perfection, you have a semblance of understanding, so therefore your benefit, you being a beneficiary, is at a very limited level. So based on Itrosayim or Hashem, based on their level of understanding, that will determine to what degree they bask in God's radiance, and to that degree they're touched. This is the Rambam, as he explains the Gemara in Brachos. Doesn't mean they have crowns. What do you mean the crown? The crown is an indication of the crown normally sits on the head. That means that's the brain. It processes it. To what degree do you process that experience? Do you fully internalize it? Are you fully touched, partially touched, or barely touched? And that will determine to what degree you experience being in the presence of God. So here, the sources of what the ultimate goal is, what perfection provides for you. We cited verses in Tehillim, in Yeshaya, and Isaiah, and other verses in prophets and scripture. And then we quoted the Gemara. Talmudic tradition. We see what it is. Based on your level of perfection, that will determine to what degree you're beneficiary of the world to come. But what's the svara? What's the logical? Why? To be able to grasp this on an intellectual, logical basis. Now, what is the soul? We read the narrative in the Torah. God formed man from dirt, from earth. And then he infused his body with a soul of life. God blew into his nostrils a soul of life. What is the neshama? What is the soul? The word neshama comes from neshima is breathing. He breathed into his nostrils a soul of life. Therefore, the neshama is called neshama because God breathed into the nostrils of the human being, and that's the soul. The soul is something which is totally spiritual. It's unrelated to anything in the physical world. It's referred to as chelek eloka mimal. It's like a part of God's essence. As God has no relevance to physicality, the soul has no relevance to physicality. That's what the soul is. Now, if that is the makeup of the soul, it has no relevance to the physical world. So when the soul departs from the body, where is its rightful location? Where it came from. It's in a realm of only spirituality, unrelated to anything that has to do with the physical world. That's its location. That's where the soul wants to go. Into its, like every species thrives in its habitat. What is the habitat of the soul? The habitat of the soul is the world to come. Because the world to come is that spiritual world. But what is the world to come? Being exposed to God, because that's where it came from. So being on the terrestrial level, the soul is really out of place. The Chofetz Chaim writes in one location, he explains with an allegory. A person takes leave of his family, travels to the other end of the world, and he says to his family, to be able to accomplish and achieve what I have to accomplish, I have to be away for 10 years. And I have to, because of the environment and the climate, what I'll be exposed to, I have to wear very thick clothing, not even comfortable, but the only way I could protect myself from the cold and the frost and many other things, I have to wear this protective garb. Not that it's comfortable, but to be able to maintain myself and accomplish what I want to, that is just the reality of what I have to do. Now, once mission is accomplished, does the person want to stay away from his family? Even when he's away, he waits for the moment when he could return because he's only here on a mission. Once the mission's accomplished, he wants to go back. Because to be in an environment which is earthy, which is painful, which is uncomfortable, it's only because of circumstance he has to be clothed in this kind of garb. The moment he finishes it, he doesn't have to wear that garb, he wants to be out of here. The soul is put into a body which is earthy, physical. It has all kinds of negative inclinations. And the soul's put into a body which there's endless challenges, complications, lack of clarity, struggles. And that's what life's all about. But once the soul achieves what it's meant to achieve, and you've succeeded, what do you want? And you've come to a level of understanding. This is not what it's all about. It's not what it's all about. I'll give you an example. A person who's truly spiritualized and understands schar b'ayal v'leko, that the innate value of a mitzvah is so infinite. If you lived 1,000 years and God gave you everything to the maximum, the material, it doesn't suffice to actually reward you for the achievement of one mitzvah. That's how unending the innate value of a mitzvah is. If a person is able to come upon that understanding, are you going to be penny wise and pound foolish? Where are you putting your eggs? In which basket? You're not investing in more material. I always say, in a almost like a facetious way, person comes and he amasses over life a portfolio of real estate, the best quality real estate, Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue. In Japan, a square foot is a fortune. And he has a portfolio. So in this world, he can flex his muscle. Do you know who I am? There's no check I can't write. There's nobody who I can't talk down to. You realize when you checkout time, you come to another realm of existence. You come with that portfolio, it's meaningless. Because God says that has no value. Only has value what I initially sent you there. To bring back what I told you to bring back, to achieve what I told you to achieve. Well, I thought this would be better. You want to write your own script? You go where that script brings you. You live the life of earthiness. But God wasn't part of your equation. Your whole equation was yourself, to empower yourself, to expand your ego, to control people. That has no relevance to the world to come, because the world comes in relation with God. To have a relation with God, you have to speak God's language. I'm not talking about Hebrew. You have to have an orientation which you could appreciate what that is because you achieved what that is. Otherwise, you don't belong there. Person was a Texan, and he had his ranch spread over miles, and he had enough cows that a side derivative of the business of cattle, he went into the fertilizer business. And he had on his ranch 2 miles worth of manure. And, and he's called the manure king. All of a sudden he passes away and he shows up with a mile wide of manure, a mile deep, a mile wide. And he comes, he smells like a rose, this guy. Comes before God and he says, look what I've achieved. He says, what did you achieve? I'm the manure king. He says, you know what it's worth? It's worth, put it in the ground. And that's where you're going, into the ground and staying in the ground. You lived a life which is the equivalent of that. What relevance do you have to the world to come? You want to have a relationship. Well, what's the relationship based upon?